The background of what GPT and generative AI are interesting topics to focus on. We're really grateful for this opportunity to be able to expand on our article and look at kind of a broader set of benefits and risks associated with generative AI. So we've kind of split this into what we call the good, the bad, and the ugly. Good and bad are pretty self-explanatory. They're the positive and negative use cases associated with ChatGPT and generative AI, particularly. So these are use cases that can apply to many industries, but we think there's ties in every single one of these back to the defense industrial base. And then the ugly, is kind of looking at some of the doomsday predictions that people have come out with recently about kind of what the potential worst case AI-driven future is. So that's kind of what we're going to cover over the next few minutes. I'll give you the caveat that we're not going to do a deep dive or any kind of significant technical analysis of these, because frankly, we wouldn't have time to. Instead, we're going to focus on trying to expose the audience to many different benefits and risks that we think are relevant to the defense industrial base. So the first couple positives are, we want to talk about some of the efficiencies that tools like ChatGPT and other generative AI bots can provide. One example I found was there's companies out there that are using AI to record their sales calls and keeping transcripts and actually providing feedback after the call is done to the people that are on these calls, saying, here's the things you said, here's some things you could maybe do better next time. Another way that companies are using this for efficiency is in the realm of graphic design. So you can use ChatGPT. You can also link up with other generative AIs that produce images to kind of quickly iterate on images that you're trying to create. So one example I found was somebody originally wanted to create a graphic of a fun, quirky car, and then they wanted to change it to a fun, quirky retro car. And literally with a few keystrokes, you can have the bot make those changes rather than you needing to actually manually make the changes to the image yourself. The other thing is, and I think this is going to be particularly interesting to see how this develops over the next few years, is the customizability of ChatGPT. So like Liv mentioned, the actual ChatGPT platform itself is based on a large language model that the OpenAI lab developed over many years. They gathered things like 30 years worth of New York Times articles and most of Reddit and all of Wikipedia and many other large online data sources like that, and curated it into the data set that is the basis for ChatGPT. But there are now a number of customizable versions that are coming out, and there's ways that people are using the kind of conversational chatbot that's built into ChatGPT, but aiming it at data sets of their choosing. So one of the examples here is Microsoft Azure, through their cloud platform, has a way that you can actually kind of choose the data set that you want to aim ChatGPT at. And I think this is an area that a lot of companies are probably going to be interested in exploring in the future. Although I think the barrier to entry here is going to remain pretty high, because in order for the tool to really be effective, you need a pretty large and pretty well curated data set to aim the tool at, but definitely something to keep an eye on over the next few months and years. Another great way to leverage tools like ChatGPT is for optimization. So one use case that we looked at here was job hunting, because it seems to be something that a lot of people are interested in right now. As more and more job postings are available with longer and longer lists of responsibilities, one way that you can use ChatGPT is to take your resume, feed it into the tool, and then also feed it a list of responsibilities and say, hey, ChatGPT, give me some ideas for how I can optimize my resume for this particular job. This is particularly powerful as more and more companies are using AI bots to kind of do the first cut of analysis on resumes. My perspective is if a bot's going to be the first one to read your resume, a bot might as well help you write your resume as well. Another area that I've played around with a little bit, I'm curious to see developments over the next few months and years, is organization, particularly data analytics. So in my personal experience, loading large data sets into tools like ChatGPT isn't necessarily intuitive or easy, although there are a number of tutorials out there for how you can do it. And there's the potential, though, as the models continue to develop, that tools like ChatGPT are going to be able to provide some unique insights more quickly than a person sorting through thousands of layers of spreadsheets. I think this one is particularly relevant to some future applications in the defense industrial base, because my experience with every company I've worked with in national security and in the contracting space usually has tons and tons of data that they have to sort through. So I think this is an area where some companies may be able to leverage this capability in the future. However, we'll talk about this when we get to the bad. You've got to be really cautious about what information you put into the tool. We'll address that more in a bit. One of the other ways that there's some benefits with ChatGPT is brainstorming, content creation, and editing. So one thing that I'll note with brainstorming is that because ChatGPT is based on a data set that's created by humans, it's not ever going to provide you with truly unique, brand new content that nobody's ever thought of before. In a lot of ways, it's just kind of regurgitating information that somebody else put in some other idea or article or tool at some point in the past. That being said, what I've found is that when I'm researching a new topic, asking ChatGPT or a tool like it to give you maybe the top 10 most important things about this topic is a good way to make sure you're not missing something obvious. Because it is based on a very large data set, it usually does a pretty good job of giving you kind of the obvious common sense things you would think of, but maybe also a couple other ideas that people have had related to whatever the topic is that you're researching that you may not have thought of. You can also use it both to create a large number of rough drafts that you then hone into something more final later, or the inverse is you create the first product and feed it into ChatGPT and ask it to provide you with edits or recommendations for how you can streamline or say it better. I will say ChatGPT is great at English grammar. It's far better than I probably ever will be. So I do like using it to edit or provide inputs for how I can make my writing better. Again, like we'll talk about in a minute, you've got to be cautious about what kind of data you actually put in there. So now that we've talked about the good, we're going to cover some of the bad. So there are a number of privacy and security concerns with ChatGPT. So one that you see in the middle there is as more and more companies put out new plugins or other ChatGPT related tools, it's also becoming a very common attack vector or lure for threat actors to put ChatGPT related content out on the internet or in emails. And because it's garnered so much interest from a lot of people, they're more likely to click on links or navigate to websites that they think are going to help them optimize and do some of the other positive things that we've talked about before. When in reality, sometimes it may just be a fake site or a fake link that a threat actor is using to get you to download malware or give up your credentials or something of that nature. The other big concern, and this is what I've referenced a couple times, is ChatGPT is based on a data set that was originally created and curated by OpenAI. However, they are continuing to train the data model on additional inputs that new people are putting in. Like Liv said, there was 100 million users in the first 2 months. There's a lot of people putting a lot of information into ChatGPT. This is a big concern for large companies. I'll use a defense industrial base example that I was thinking of earlier today. So let's say that Raytheon and Boeing are competing for a contract at some point in the future. And Boeing knows that Raytheon has spent the last 2 years feeding all of their contract proposals into ChatGPT and asking it for advice on how they can streamline and do better. Knowing that, Boeing could go to ChatGPT and say, hey, ChatGPT, pretend that you're a contracting officer for Raytheon. How would you handle this situation? How would you write this contract proposal? And it's possible that the information that ChatGPT gives back to that Boeing person may actually in some ways be based on information that Raytheon had previously put in. So this is where I said before, I think some companies looking at ways to leverage ChatGPT on their own data sets is going to be one area of particular interest in the future, because just feeding personal or sensitive or proprietary data into the tool that's open to everyone might have some long-term unintended consequences.
Yeah, it's not supposed to store I see some discussion in the chat about this. So it's not supposed to store your personal data, but like in Italy, like some of the training data did include personal data from Italian citizens. So like Italy's introduced a temporary emergency ban on demanding OpenAI to stop using this personal information. So OpenAI stopped people in Italy from accessing the chatbot. So in general, there's no kind of real coherent regulation against ChatGPT and other forms of generative AI yet, but other countries are kind of taking, besides the United States, are taking more strides in this direction. So Europe is kind of getting more strict about this, given their general data protection regulations, one of the strongest privacy and data protection laws in the world. Kind of their European Parliament members are considering an act that may kind of constitute regulations on ChatGPT to prevent this kind of thing. So in OpenAI, their model is closed, so we don't have insight into their decision making and the neural networks that comprise the GPT 3.5 and 4 system. So they're not supposed to store personal data. Also, cyber criminal activity kind of could change this too and allow it to be transferred. So, all right, Noah.
Yeah, no, thanks, Liv. And the other thing too, there was an instance about a month after ChatGPT came out where there was a vulnerability that was discovered where people were able to view some of the inputs that another person had put into it. Now, that wasn't by design in the tool, but it was something that was discovered by a threat researcher. So that also kind of raised the concerns with a number of companies. How secure is this data that I'm actually putting in here? Are other people going to be able to see even the questions that I'm asking this in the first place? So I think there's more to explore in those areas. Like Liv mentioned, a lot of countries are moving to regulate these technologies more closely. And I think as that happens, we'll discover more about kind of what's behind the curtain in some of these cases. We've talked a little bit already about some of the negatives associated with this tool, but another is new and enhanced attack vectors. So one that I think is particularly relevant now is historically about 90% or so of cyber intrusions into companies happen after somebody clicks on something they shouldn't have in a phishing email. It used to be a lot of the training around employees catching phishing emails had to do with look for incorrect grammar or punctuation or items that don't necessarily make sense in the context of your business. And that was kind of the hallmark of here's what a bad email looks like. With ChatGPT, it's very easy, or it's become very easy for threat actors to make very realistic looking phishing emails with very little effort. I mean, within a few seconds, you can create a very realistic looking phishing email. That's something that I think is kind of a short-term concern. In the long term, there are some concerns about the coding abilities within ChatGPT and how they could allow threat actors to kind of develop malicious code. Now, ChatGPT itself will tell you that it can't produce malicious code, but if you tell it that it's for pen testing instead of actually trying to penetrate an organization, it sometimes will give you some interesting results. That being said, like Liv mentioned before, at this point, the coding abilities of ChatGPT are kind of at an entry level. I mean, it's passed an entry level Google coding exam. But from everything that I've talked to people about in this topic, and I think this is a common thread that you're going to see through several of these topics that we're talking about, is ChatGPT is not a tool that a novice can take and immediately become an expert. If you harness the efficiencies within the tool and you link it up with someone who already has some baseline expertise in an area, they can create some really significant outputs. But it's not something where somebody who has no background in software engineering or creating any kind of malware in the past could create this very robust malware out of nothing. But I saw an article recently where the founder of OpenAI was talking about how he thinks of the current iterations of ChatGPT as kind of like the first model of the iPhone, and how over the course of the next few years, we're going to see significant developments in this technology. So kind of a longer term concern is, once ChatGPT gets better at coding, is it going to lower the barrier to entry for threat actors to make malware?
Yeah, well said, Noah. And ChatGPT is subject to all the same problems that plague other types of AI. So jumping in on the black box problem here. So The black box problem in and of itself, we put here, it's not exactly an attack vector. So the black box problem in AI in general just refers to the fact we can't gaze into neural networks and understand how they use their weighted networks to come to the final output decisions. But there can be attacks like AI poisoning, where attackers manipulate training data by injecting poisoned or diluted data to control the behavior of trained ML models and deliver false results. So if bad or just irresponsible actors, or even like managers of ChatGPT-esque technology, if they have poisoned GPT data or algorithms to provide toxic entries or answers, we can't identify that readily due to the black box problem. So even if hackers can immediately jump in and use like perfect code to attack, but AI poisoning kind of exacerbates the potential attack vectors with technologies like ChatGPT. So,
yeah, thanks for that, Liv. So the final kind of bad thing that we're going to talk about with ChatGPT is, we've mentioned this already, but biased and incorrect information. So this is something I think has gotten maybe most of the press in the US, at least. There have been concerns from both the political right and the political left about various biases that ChatGPT has shown in certain answers. I think the most interesting research that's been done in this area was a group of researchers actually gave ChatGPT a handful of personality tests and a bias test, just to see where the kind of basic language model that OpenAI put out there falls. What they found was that ChatGPT perceives itself to be highly open and agreeable. It has a Myers-Briggs personality type of ENFJ. It's among the bottom 15% of test takers in the realm of the dark triad personality traits. And from a political perspective, ChatGPT came out as having progressive views, but no significant bias between authoritarian and libertarian. I heard one person joke in the aftermath of this article coming out that ChatGPT sounded a lot like a tech bro from Silicon Valley. And honestly, I have a hard time disagreeing with that. The reality is OpenAI had several hundred employees that they hired from Silicon Valley over several years building and training these models. And I think it's kind of interesting that, at least in some ways, it appears that even this kind of impersonal technology kind of took on the personality of its creators, or at least it would kind of seem that way. The other thing when it comes to incorrect information, this was a news story that came out a couple of weeks ago that I thought was particularly interesting. There was a lawyer who used ChatGPT to file a motion in court, and they found out after the fact that several pieces of information that ChatGPT included in that motion were incorrect. And even when the lawyer went back and asked ChatGPT to provide the sources that it used, the tool basically made up court cases that didn't exist and cited it as precedent. I think this highlights one of the biggest flaws in tools like ChatGPT, which is that the way that they're designed right now, they don't really know how to say, I don't know. So if they have the answer, they'll give you the answer. And if they don't have the answer, they'll make up a plausible sounding answer. So this is definitely something to be aware of when you're using these tools, that the outputs that it gives you need to be fact checked, and that you shouldn't just trust the output or even the sources that it cites necessarily. So bottom line is, ChatGPT is a powerful tool that can do a lot of good, but it's not universally without fault. And even OpenAI, if you go to their main page before it'll even let you use ChatGPT, it gives you kind of a list of warning labels. And one of the things it says is that the outputs of this tool are not always correct and are sometimes biased. So even they acknowledge that it's not a perfect tool. All right, so before we move on to a few more kind of defense industrial based specific use cases, we wanted to address some of what we call the doomsday predictions that people have put out recently related to AI. You see some of the headlines here: AI poses a risk of extinction. There's one of the founding fathers of AI quit Google to warn about the technology's dangers. That middle one, I think, was particularly interesting to me because the quote that came from that person was that he thought the rapid progress of AI was going to transform society in ways that we don't fully understand, and not all the effects are going to be good. I think that's a kind of measured approach to the future, where it's obvious that as technology in general and AI in particular continues to accelerate the pace at which we do life and business, we're not always aware of the ways that technology is impacting our lives until maybe a few years after the fact. That being said, I'm personally a little bit skeptical of some of the more doomsday looks at the future of AI. To be perfectly honest, I'm not sure that the motivations behind all of those doomsday predictions are necessarily where they should be. A couple examples are, if you're a competitor of OpenAI and you're trying to catch up to them, it might be worth your while to push for government regulation that says that companies like OpenAI can't release any more tools for a certain period of time until we can figure out how to do it safely, because that might give your company the chance to catch up to the industry leader. And on the other hand, if you're OpenAI, you might be lobbying Congress to try to put more restrictions on the development of AI. I can't remember the exact source of this. I apologize that I can't give you the citation, but I remember hearing somebody say a few weeks ago that their estimation of OpenAI pushing for regulation was that OpenAI was telling Congress, hey, that ladder that we just used to climb to the top of the AI world, it's not safe for anyone else to come up after us. So that being said, I'm not sure that the motivations are completely pure behind all of these doomsday predictions, but it's definitely something that we should continue to take seriously, particularly because of that last example at the bottom there. So there was an Air Force colonel that came out. So initially he spoke at a conference, and the way that he made it sound was that the Air Force had actually run a simulation where they had a drone controlled by AI that was supposed to find and eliminate targets. And after a few iterations of the drone telling the operator, this is a target that I think I should destroy, and the operator saying, no, you shouldn't, the drone started to target the operator because the operator was the primary barrier to the drone completing its mission. The colonel later backtracked those statements and said that it was a thought experiment, not an actual simulation that the Air Force had run. But I think what this highlights is that as we continue to integrate AI into many different parts of our lives and into the defense industrial base and ultimately into weapons systems, we are going to need to be very cautious about making sure that we put the right guardrails and checks and balances in place to make sure that we're doing it in a safe way.